The party was full. Laughter, conversations, and the clinking of glasses mixed with the background music, creating an atmosphere that should be light, but for me was suffocating. I arrived by surprise, something inside me already restless, a voice whispering that I needed to be there. Maybe it was tiredness from years of doubts and assumptions, or maybe it was something deeper, an intuition that wouldn't leave me alone. When I opened the door, the room seemed to freeze. In the middle of the crowd, my gaze found her. She was laughing, but it wasn't the laugh I knew, the one that won me over years ago. It was a laugh that was too light, too familiar, and directed at someone else. Only a few steps were needed to confirm what I already feared. She didn't notice my presence immediately, she was too busy whispering something in his ear, while their hands touched each other intimately, shamelessly, as if nothing else in the world mattered. My heart stopped for a moment. Time stretched out and seemed to play with me, forcing me to watch every detail of that scene. Their touch, their complicit smile, the look that should only be mine. I took a deep breath and approached. This time, she saw me, and the expression on her face changed instantly. First, confusion. Then, panic. He tried to hide it, moving away slightly, but there was no hiding it anymore. Everything was exposed, as clear as the light that illuminated that room. She mumbled something, but I didn't hear her. My mind was focused on the moment I took the envelope out of my jacket pocket and handed it into his hands. My voice came out firm, firmer than I expected. I already suspected everything. You were always a fake person. Silence took over the surrounding environment. She held the envelope with a mixture of disbelief and despair. He, not knowing what to do, just remained there, static, like a spectator of his own ruin. The party continued for others, but for us, that moment was eternal. I turned, not looking back, but feeling every gaze that followed me, every silent judgment. On the way home, thoughts assaulted me, each one more painful than the last. The years of marriage, the promises exchanged, the plans made together. It all seemed like a big lie. The feeling of betrayal was as physical as a blow to the stomach, a pain that wouldn't let up. Every memory now came with a bitter taste, as if it were tainted by that night's discovery. I mentally replayed the little signs that I had ignored. The excuses to leave work early, the deleted messages, the distance she tried to hide with superficial gestures of affection. Now everything made sense. And yet, it wasn't just the pain of betrayal that consumed me, but the humiliation. Knowing that she chose that moment, that public place, to expose the fragility of our relationship. My mind asked itself incessantly, why? What did I fail to do, what was missing in me for her to look for someone else? But a part of me knew these questions were vain. The betrayal wasn't my fault. It didn't matter how much I had given, how many sacrifices I had made. She had made her choice, and now the consequences would catch up with her. The next morning I woke up with a frightening calm. It wasn't a peaceful tranquility, but a kind of emotional anesthesia that allowed me to function without being consumed by the chaos within. My phone rang several times, messages and connections ignored. I knew she would try to explain, justify the unjustifiable. But no words from her could change what had happened. As I sipped my coffee, the plan began to form in my mind. I wouldn't just leave her. She and that man would pay for every moment of disrespect, for every lie. The anger that boiled inside me was not the kind of anger that explodes, but rather the kind that meticulously builds, piece by piece, something that cannot be undone. They had destroyed my trust, my peace, and I would destroy the perfect world they believed they had created. Deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. She was skilled at manipulating, at turning situations in her favor. And him? He seemed like the kind of man who believed he was above consequences, untouchable in his arrogance. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. The silence I maintained was not a sign of weakness. It was just the prelude of what was to come. The next few weeks were filled with a mix of veiled confrontations and unexpected revelations. I discovered secrets that she never imagined I could uncover. Details about the lover, his life, his reputation. Each piece of information was like a brick in the building of revenge. I wouldn't just be a victim. It would turn their betrayal into his undoing. When the moment finally arrived, everything was prepared. She still tried to get closer, with emotional messages and requests to meet. He disappeared, probably realizing that I wasn't as easily manipulated as they thought. But it didn't matter. The truth would come out in a way that no one could ignore. And as the fateful day approached, one last question hung in the air. What would happen when they realized that their actions had not only destroyed our marriage, but also their own lives? Welcome to the channel where the truths about cheating come to light. Here, we never support any type of infidelity. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful message. Betrayal destroys lives, relationships, and everything we touch. Get ready for an intense and shocking narrative, full of twists and emotions. Sit back, take a deep breath, and dive into this story that will captivate you from beginning to end. Happy listening. In the heart of a city that seemed to pulse between chaos and tranquility, lived the couple whose story was about to unfold in an unexpected way. Ethan and Clara had been married for just over 10 years. They were the portrait of an apparently balanced life, built on pillars that combined the initial enthusiasm of love with the solidity of routine. Ethan was a methodical, analytical man, always attentive to details that others would miss. Working as a civil engineer, he spent his days dealing with calculations and projects that shaped urban space, but it was at home that he found what he called true purpose. Clara, on the other hand, was the essence of dynamism. As an event planner, her schedule was full of meetings, parties, and planning that seemed to never end, but there was always room for the smile that lit up every place she entered. They shared a house that reflected their personalities, at once organized and welcoming. The walls were decorated with photos of trips they took together in the first years of their marriage, reminders of times when everything seemed less complicated, more authentic. Small details around the house revealed the contrasts between them. The shelves organized by Ethan, where each book was in alphabetical order, contrasted with Clara's stacks of magazines and catalogs, spread out in an almost chaotic manner, but which still seemed part of their own aesthetic. Their routine was like a synchronized dance, but not always harmonious. Ethan woke up early, the sound of his alarm clock marking the start of his calculated days. Clara, in turn, had difficulty getting out of bed, often stretching until the last second before jumping into the shower and beginning her daily marathon. They had their differences, but they always found a middle ground. However, what once seemed like complementarity began to be perceived as distance. Small moments that previously went unnoticed began to take their toll, like the text messages that Clara sent less frequently during the day or the nights when Ethan remained silent for hours, immersed in his thoughts. Dinners together, which were once a sacred ritual, began to be replaced by quick meals or, on some nights, by uncomfortable silence at the table. Ethan was reserved with his feelings, something Clara always found a little frustrating. On the other hand, she was outgoing, but lately, her energy seemed misplaced, focused on something he couldn't identify. Both felt something was out of place, but neither knew how to start the conversation that could bring answers. The couple's close friends noticed the subtle changes, but no one dared to question them directly. Ethan has always been discreet in his social interactions, preferring to observe rather than be the center of attention. Clara, however, was magnetic, attracting people like a magnet in any environment. This difference had never been a problem for them before, but now it seemed to create a gap, as if they were living in parallel universes within the same house. Weekends, which were previously dedicated to outings or small household projects, have become moments of mechanical routine. Ethan enjoyed walking in the park near the house, a space he found almost therapeutic. Clara, on the other hand, often said she was busy with work or made up last-minute appointments. He didn't question it, at least not openly. Still, her excuses were starting to sound rehearsed, and Ethan, who had always trusted his wife completely, began to feel a shadow of doubt growing. However, there were also moments that were reminiscent of the past. An impromptu breakfast, where Clara insisted on preparing pancakes with fruit, or a smile that she threw at Ethan while he was distracted. These fragments of affection kept hope alive, as if they were a reminder that the connection still existed, even if it was weakened. But the doubt had a greater weight, and Ethan knew that something needed to be done, even if he still didn't know exactly what. Clara was also not oblivious to what was happening. She perceived Ethan's silence as a kind of judgment, even though he had never said anything. She felt trapped in a routine that, although comfortable, no longer brought her the same happiness as before. But how do you explain this to Ethan? How could she put into words something that even she couldn't fully understand? Sometimes, during the events she organized, Clara would find herself thinking about how their lives had changed, and the thought would consume her, leaving her restless. Despite the clouds that hung over their relationship, there was still a bond that united them. A kind of silent pact, built over the years, that made them keep trying, even if sometimes in different ways. Ethan, for example, started planning a surprise trip for the two of them. He believed that perhaps a change of scenery could rekindle something between them, like the trips they took in their early years. Clara, on the other hand, tried to revive small traditions, like watching a movie together or preparing a special dinner, but there was always something that distracted her, something that prevented her from dedicating herself completely. The scene around the couple seemed to conspire to keep up appearances. Neighbors saw them as an example of stability. At work, Clara was admired for her efficiency and charisma, while Ethan was respected for his intelligence and dedication. But inside the house, the reality was different. The tension was not explosive, but constant, like a thread that could snap at any moment. That particular night, as Clara was preparing for another event and Ethan was in his home office finishing up a project, the distance between them seemed greater than ever. He looked at the clock and realized he hadn't seen her in hours, even though they were under the same roof. She felt a tightness in her chest, a feeling he couldn't explain. He picked up his phone to send a message, but gave up before typing. Clara, in turn, looked at herself in the mirror and hesitated for a moment. Something inside her made her want to stay, but the weight of habit pushed her toward the door. And so, the night began. Two worlds that coexisted, but slowly began to move apart. The days went by at a seemingly normal pace in Ethan and Clara's lives, but the invisible tension that separated them became more palpable. Ethan began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Clara seemed to be paying more attention to her phone than to what was happening around her. The laughter that used to come spontaneously at home was now reserved for silent conversations that she tried to hide. He wasn't the paranoid type of man, he always believed in the power of dialogue, but this time he felt like something was slipping through his fingers. There was a space, something that he couldn't identify, but that disturbed him deeply. One night, as Clara said she was going out to run something related to work, Ethan noticed the hesitation in her voice. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. She wore a dress he hadn't seen in a while, something he used to praise, but that night, it didn't seem like it was for him. He watched in silence as she finished her makeup, casually asking about the event, but her answers were evasive, calculated, almost rehearsed. When she left, he stood in the living room, looking at the door for a few minutes, feeling an emptiness that he didn't know how to fill. Over the next few days, Ethan tried to ignore the growing discomfort. He tried to convince himself that it was just stress, accumulated tiredness from work and routine. But the doubts returned like a current every time Clara left or seemed distant even though she was by his side. He tried to broach the subject subtly over breakfast, but she diverted the conversation with a skill that left him disconcerted. He knew her well enough to know something was wrong, but he couldn't find the courage to pressure her. Clara, on the other hand, was experiencing a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She knew she was pulling away, but she couldn't stop herself. She felt torn between the security of the home they built together and an impulse she couldn't control. The weight of the decisions she was making tormented her, but she always found justifications that made her move forward. Deep down, she felt a guilt that consumed her, but still she continued to follow a path that she knew was dangerous. One night, Ethan received a text from a close friend inviting him to dinner. He accepted it as an attempt to escape the thoughts that suffocated him. In the restaurant, the conversation flowed between laughter and memories, but he couldn't completely disconnect from his restlessness. At one point, the friend commented something that caught his attention. He mentioned, without much malice, having recently seen Clara in a place she had never mentioned, at a time that did not match what she claimed to be doing. Ethan hid his surprise, but something inside him seemed to snap. He didn't show anything at the moment, but he felt like that was the missing piece to put together the puzzle that had been haunting his thoughts. When he returned home, his mind was flooded with possibilities. He found himself thinking of scenarios he never imagined, each one more painful than the last. Doubt gave way to a sense of urgency, an almost instinctive need to discover the truth. Over the next few days, he started paying more attention. I noticed the schedules, the patterns, the details that previously seemed insignificant. Clara, in turn, seemed increasingly distant, oblivious to the fact that Ethan was beginning to put the pieces of the puzzle together. It was then that, on a Saturday morning, while Clara said she needed to leave for a meeting, Ethan decided to take action. He waited a few minutes after she left and then followed her. He felt a mix of adrenaline and anguish as he drove carefully, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't notice. His heart was beating so hard that he could hear the sound in his ears, but his determination was greater than any hesitation. She parked in front of a cafe in a neighborhood Ethan rarely visited. He saw her get out of the car, checking her reflection in a shop window before entering. A few minutes later, he saw her at the table with someone else. A man. They laughed, talked in a tone that seemed too intimate to be just work. Ethan stood frozen in the car, watching the scene with a mix of disbelief and pain. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the expressions were clear, unmistakable. Something inside him screamed to go in and confront them right then and there, but he held himself back. He decided to observe, take it all in, let the moment strengthen him for what came next. Upon leaving the cafe, Clara and the man walked together to a car. Ethan saw them enter and followed at a distance. Night approached, and the streets began to fill with lights. He followed them to a house, small, discreet, on a quiet street. They walked in, and Ethan parked across the street, feeling the weight of what he was about to face. He stayed in the car for a few minutes, trying to organize his thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense. He finally got out, crossed the street and stopped in front of the door. Anger and pain were mixed in his chest, but he knew he needed answers. When the door opened, the impact was instantaneous. Clara was there, with the man in the background, both of them frozen at the sight of him. The silence was deafening, and Ethan felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Her look was a mixture of surprise and guilt, while the man seemed to not know how to react. Ethan didn't need to say anything at that moment. Everything was clear, and words would be insufficient to express what he felt. He turned and left, leaving behind a scene he never imagined would be part of his life. As he walked back to his car, a thought plagued him. That was just the beginning. The betrayal was exposed, but he knew there was more hidden. And he was determined to find out every detail, whatever the cost. Ethan was standing in the living room of the house that he now recognized as the place where Clara and that man shared moments that should have been theirs. Anger boiled under his skin, but he forced himself to take a deep breath, to control the urge to explode at that moment. The betrayal was no longer a mystery, but he knew there was something more. Something that Clara hid, something that complicit smiles and evasive looks couldn't disguise. He had spent the last few days gathering information, pieces of a puzzle that still seemed incomplete, but was about to be solved. And Ethan had decided that, at that moment, Clara would be faced with everything. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor. His posture was a mix of guilt and defensiveness, as if he was trying to prepare himself for what was to come. The man whose name Ethan had finally learned, Mark, was standing beside her, in an uncomfortable silence, as if he had realized that his presence was only making the situation worse. The room was charged with tension, each second dragging by as if time had turned into a cruel adversary. Ethan finally broke the silence. His voice was low, but carried with a contained strength that made each word weigh like a sentence. He looked directly at Clara, completely ignoring Mark. "I want to hear it from your mouth. Everything. No lies, no bullshit. Just the truth. Why did you do this? Why did you throw us into this abyss?" Clara slowly looked up, but her mouth seemed unable to form words. Ethan continued, his voice now firmer. "I loved you. I built my life by your side, and now everything I see is a sham. So tell me. What's behind it all?" Clara finally found her voice, but it sounded fragile, hesitant. "Ethan, I don't know where to start. I didn't plan for things to come to this. He interrupted her, with a coldness that made her retreat slightly onto the couch. "You didn't plan. So tell me, Clara, how did you fall so far to bring this man into our lives?" Mark stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Look, I think it's clear enough. There's no reason to keep this up. It's my fault, Ethan turned to him for the first time, his eyes cutting like a blade. "Shut up. You're insignificant here. I'm not talking to you." Mark hesitated, but retreated silently. Clara looked at Ethan, and something in her eyes changed. Maybe it was the weight of guilt, or the realization that there was no longer any way to avoid confrontation. She sighed, as if gathering the courage to say what needed to be said. "It wasn't just that, Ethan. It wasn't just a mistake or a betrayal. There's more. Something I never wanted you to find out." The air in the room seemed to disappear for an instant. Ethan felt the weight of those words before he even fully understood them. He crossed his arms, as if that could protect him from what was to come. "Continue." Clara looked away for a moment, but then looked back at him, with tears in her eyes. "Me and Mark. It wasn't just a fling. We were working on something together, something that started long before all of this. He was the one who introduced me to another life I was leading." Ethan frowned, confused. "Another life? What are you talking about?" Clara hesitated again, but Mark intervened, as if he could no longer hold the weight of the secret. "She's talking about the money, Ethan. About how it all started. Clara was embezzling money from the events company you invested in together." The confession fell like a bomb. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach as he tried to process what he had just heard. "Are you saying she was stealing from our company? Is this some kind of joke?" Clara shook her head quickly, desperate. "I never meant to harm you, Ethan. I was in a difficult place, and Mark convinced me it was something small, something you would never notice. At first, they were insignificant amounts, but then I lost control." Ethan took a step back, as if he needed distance to absorb the betrayal in its full extent. "So, it wasn't enough to betray me emotionally. You also destroyed the trust one had in what we built together. You used our company, our lives, as if they were disposable." Clara started to cry, but Ethan wasn't moved. He looked at Mark, who now looked uncomfortable, almost regretful. "What about you? What did you gain from this, other than destroying a marriage?" Mark tried to explain, but his words sounded empty, without substance. I was just helping Clara. She was lost, and I thought I could." Ethan interrupted him again. "You thought you could use her weakness to your advantage. You don't need to say anything else." Silence returned to the room, but now it was filled with the awareness of what had been revealed. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to find some clarity amidst the chaos. He looked at Clara once more, and his voice was low but firm. "You destroyed everything. And what's worse, you did it knowingly. There's nothing more to be said. I'm leaving, but it doesn't end here. You and he will face the consequences, Clara. And I will guarantee be as severe as possible. He turned and left, leaving Clara and Mark alone in the room. The door closed with a click, but the sound seemed to reverberate in Clara's mind, like an echo of the end of everything she had built. The revelation was complete, but the consequences were just beginning to take shape. Ethan knew his life would never be the same, but one thing was certain, he wouldn't be the only one to pay for everything that happened. Ethan left the house and got into the car with his hands shaking. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if it could contain the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. Anger and disappointment burned like embers in his chest, but there was something more, the feeling of being on the edge of a precipice. Everything he had built with Clara, everything he believed to be true, had turned into a mirage. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man to simply accept defeat. He knew he needed to act, and quickly. He drove aimlessly for some time, until he realized he was not far from his lawyer's office. It was late, but he knew he couldn't wait until the next day. He needed a plan. He parked the car and walked up the stairs with firm steps, determination beginning to take the place of confusion. The lawyer, a middle-aged man known for his strategic approach, was organizing some paperwork when Ethan walked in unannounced. The expression on the lawyer's face immediately changed. He knew something serious had happened. Ethan began to speak, his voice firm but charged with emotions he was trying to control. He told everything, from the betrayal to the discovery of embezzlement in the company. I can't let this go. They not only destroyed my trust, but they also tried to ruin me. I want every penny she took to be tracked, I want her to face the legal consequences of this. The lawyer listened attentively, taking notes. After a while, he looked up and responded with calculated calm. We'll deal with this, Ethan. But you need to be prepared. Exposing Clara like this won't be easy, especially since it involves a company that bears your name. We need hard evidence, something that directly connects them to this. Ethan took a deep breath, realizing this was going to be a long and tiring battle. He knew that exposing Clara would be a hard blow, but he felt he had no other choice. She had crossed all limits, and now he needed to act, not just for justice, but to rebuild his own life. That same night, Clara was at home alone. Mark had left shortly after Ethan left, muttering something about avoiding more trouble. She sat in the room, the silence around her louder than any sound that could have filled the space. Guilt weighed like an anchor. She knew she had crossed all limits, but she never imagined things would get to this point. Ethan's look before leaving never left his mind, full of pain and contempt. It was as if he was looking at a stranger, someone he had never met. The hours dragged on, and Clara began to wonder what would come next. She knew Ethan wouldn't stand still. He was methodical, determined, and now he had more than enough reasons to act. The thought of being publicly exposed terrified her, but she knew she deserved it. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how it had all gotten to this point. Where did she lose control? As she was deep in thought, Mark called. His voice was tense, almost desperate. Clara, we need to talk. Ethan isn't going to let this go. He's going to come after us, and I'm not willing to face this alone. Clara closed her eyes, trying to contain her frustration. You think I don't know that? I know he's going to come after us, Mark. But running away now will only make things worse. Mark sighed on the other end of the line, but before he could respond, Clara continued. I need to deal with this somehow. Maybe there's a way to make things right. The next day, Ethan was at his house, organizing documents and messages that could serve as evidence against Clara. He had spent the night reviewing contracts and financial transactions, increasingly convinced that he needed to see this through to the end. But while he was reading the papers, he heard a knock on the door. When he opened it, he saw Clara. She looked different, paler, more tired, as if the last few days had drained her of all the energy she had. "Ethan, please. I need to talk to you." He hesitated, but finally stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Clara seemed nervous, looking around as if searching for the right words. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I need you to listen to me." Ethan crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "Listen. What do you want me to hear, Clara? Another lie? Another excuse?" She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No. I just want to tell you the truth. The whole truth." Ethan sighed, gesturing for her to continue. Clara began to speak, and this time there was no hesitation. She talked about how she felt lost, how Mark came into her life offering a solution to problems she didn't know how to solve. He talked about despair, about how everything got out of control. "I'm not trying to justify what I did, Ethan. I know it was wrong. But I needed you to know how I got here." Ethan listened silently, his face expressionless as her words filled the room. When she finished, silence settled again. He finally spoke, his voice calmer than before. "Do you think this changes anything, Clara? Do you think I can just forget everything you did because you were lost?" She lowered her head, without response. Ethan continued. "I'm going to see this through, Clara. You're going to face the consequences, you and Mark. And I'm going to move forward, with or without you." Clara looked up, surprised. "With or without me? Are you thinking about forgiving me?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "It's not forgiveness, Clara. It's just the understanding that I can't let this consume me. But that doesn't mean I'll forget. You destroyed everything, and I don't know if anything can be rebuilt from it." She nodded, the tears finally falling. "I'm sorry, Ethan. More than you can imagine." He just watched her, speechless, as she left. The door closed behind her, leaving Ethan alone again. But this time, he felt something different. It wasn't peace, but maybe it was the beginning of something close to it. He knew the road would be long, but he was willing to face it, one step at a time. Ethan spent the next few days in a state of almost constant restlessness. His mind wavered between the relief of having confronted Clara and the crushing pain of dealing with the reality of what she had done. He tried to occupy his time with work, meetings with his lawyer and visits to the company to assess the damage caused by Clara's actions. But even immersed in numbers and contracts, he couldn't shake thoughts of everything he had lost. It wasn't just their marriage that was in shambles, but also their trust, security, and the idea that their life was built on solid foundations. Clara, in turn, was living a kind of emotional exile. She had withdrawn from everything, even Mark. He tried to contact her a few times, but she ignored his messages and calls. His presence now felt like a constant reminder of her poor choices, a shadow she no longer wanted to carry. In his mind, there was only one priority, trying to repair, in some way, the damage he had caused. But how to start? She knew Ethan wouldn't trust her again and that the legal system would be ruthless in the face of the evidence he had gathered. Still, she felt she needed to find a way to face the consequences with dignity. One night, Ethan received an unexpected call from Clara. He hesitated before answering, but something inside him compelled him to press the button and listen to what she had to say. Her voice was hesitant, almost inaudible, as if each word required enormous effort. "Ethan, I know I'm the last person you want to talk to right now, but I need to try to make this right. Please meet me tomorrow. I just want to explain a few things." He remained silent for a few seconds before responding, with a dry tone. "That doesn't change anything, Clara. But I'll listen to what you have to say." The meeting took place in a park, away from curious eyes and the pressure of a family environment. Clara looked more fragile than ever, but there was a determination in her eyes that Ethan hadn't seen before. She began to speak, bluntly, admitting every mistake, every decision that led to betrayal and embezzlement. But this time, there was something different about his approach. She brought documents that showed how she intended to repair the financial loss. "I know this doesn't erase what I did, but I want to try to give back what I took, Ethan. I don't want you to think I was just trying to escape the consequences." He leafed through the papers in silence, feeling a mixture of relief and suspicion. "That's a start, Clara. But it doesn't change the fact that you chose to betray me, in every way possible." As they talked, the weight of the situation seemed to fall on both of them in different ways. For Ethan, it was a reminder of how fragile love could be, how everything that seemed right could fall apart in a matter of months. For Clara, it was an opportunity to face the truth about herself, to face the person she had become and try to find a way back. They talked for hours, revisiting moments from the past, trying to understand where everything started to go wrong. There were no guarantees, no promises of reconciliation, but there was a glimmer of mutual understanding, even if it was too late. Meanwhile, Mark faced his own difficulties. Ethan had started legal proceedings against him as well, and his career was threatened by the ongoing investigations. He tried to contact Clara again, hoping to find some support, but she firmly rejected him. "You were part of this, Mark, but I can't get involved with you anymore. I need to fix my life, and that starts with leaving you behind." He didn't insist. Maybe he knew, deep down, that what they shared was never real, just an illusion built on impulse and convenience. The days turned into weeks, and the tension began to ease, but it didn't completely disappear. Ethan realized that although he could never forget what happened, he needed to find a way to move on. He began to spend more time on himself, exploring interests he had set aside during his marriage. She found comfort in small gestures like walking outside, reading books that were gathering dust on her bookshelf, and even reconnecting with old friends. He didn't know if he was ready to open his heart again, but he knew life couldn't stop. Clara, on the other hand, was immersed in a reconstruction process. She began attending therapy, something she had never considered before, and got involved in volunteer work as a way of trying to rediscover purpose. She knew the wounds she caused would never be completely healed, but she hoped her efforts would show Ethan, and perhaps herself, that she could be better than what she had become. One night, Ethan received a message from Clara. It was not a request for reconciliation, nor an attempt to justify his mistakes. It was a sincere letter, where she thanked him for the years they spent together and expressed her regret in a way he had never seen before. He read the message several times, feeling a lump in his throat, but not knowing exactly how to respond. He put away his phone and went for a walk, letting the fresh air calm his thoughts. The moral dilemma Ethan now faced was clear: forgiving Clara would mean giving up pain, but also accepting that some things could never go back to the way they were before. Moving forward without her would be a challenge, but also an opportunity to rediscover who he was outside of marriage. The decision had not yet been made, but one thing was certain: he would not be defined by betrayal. He had the power to shape his future, and he was determined to do so no matter what path he chose. Ethan felt the weight of the choices he needed to make as the days slowly progressed. He had gone through an internal reconstruction process, but he knew that completely closing that story would require more. It was not enough to simply move forward without looking back. He needed to deal with every fragment of the life that had been shattered. Clara's betrayal, Mark's involvement, and even the wounds he himself carried needed to be confronted. He didn't want to leave loose ends, and that decision guided him to that moment. The legal case against Clara and Mark was progressing, and Ethan was determined to seek justice, but without turning it into a personal crusade for revenge. He knew that what Clara had done was serious, but he also understood that her punishment had already begun long before any sentence. She lived in a shadow of regret and loss, trying to find a way to redeem herself. Ethan chose not to participate in all of the hearings. He trusted the system to do the necessary work. However, his absence was not a sign of disinterest, but of exhaustion. He didn't want to prolong the suffering any longer than necessary. Clara, in turn, faced the court with unexpected dignity. She did not try to dodge the accusations or manipulate the narrative to protect herself. Every word she said seemed to carry the weight of her guilt, but also a sincere desire to repair the damage. During one of the trials, she looked at Ethan for the first time in months, and what he saw was not the woman who had betrayed him, but someone who was finally confronting the truth about herself. He looked away, not out of contempt, but because he knew that looking for another second would resurface feelings he was trying to leave behind. Mark, in contrast, took a different approach. He tried to minimize his responsibility, placing most of the blame on Clara. This strategy, however, was quickly dismantled by Ethan's lawyers, who presented overwhelming evidence of Mark's active involvement in the scheme. When the sentence was announced, Mark was sentenced to a severe sentence, including imprisonment and substantial fines. He left the courtroom with a downcast expression, and for the first time, he seemed to understand the extent of his actions. Clara received a more lenient sentence, with measures including money back and community service. She accepted the decision without question, as if it were the first step towards something she herself needed to overcome. After the case closed, Ethan felt a strange sense of emptiness. He had achieved what he sought, justice. But that didn't bring the relief he expected. He realized that, despite everything, what really mattered now was what he would do with the future before him. He began exploring new possibilities, including a change of scenery. He sold the house where so many memories were recorded, both good and bad, and decided to start somewhere new, where he wouldn't be constantly reminded of everything he had lost. Clara remained in the city, working to rebuild her life. She dedicated herself to community service with an intensity that surprised even herself. Every day was an opportunity to learn something about who she wanted to be, not just for others, but for herself. She knew Ethan would never completely forgive her, but that didn't stop her from trying to forgive herself. She began writing, a habit she had abandoned years ago, and found paper a safe space to process everything that had happened. Ethan, on the other hand, found a new balance over time. He got involved in work projects that challenged him in different ways, and on a business trip he met someone who made him smile again. It wasn't love at first sight, but a slowly growing connection, based on honest conversations and small gestures that reminded her she could still be trusted. He wasn't in a hurry, but he also wasn't closing the doors on what the future might bring. One day, months after the trial ended, Ethan received a letter from Clara. He opened it hesitantly, but the words inside were not apologies or calls for reconciliation. It was a thank you. She expressed gratitude for the time they had shared, for the lessons she had learned, and said she hoped they both found the peace they sought. Ethan read the letter several times before putting it away in a drawer, not knowing if he would ever respond. Mark disappeared from the scene, probably trying to start over somewhere else, away from everything and everyone who knew him. His name, however, was marked by the scandals he helped create, and Ethan knew that that man would hardly cause problems for anyone again. Ethan and Clara followed completely separate paths, but there was something that connected their stories, the certainty that, even in the worst circumstances, there was room for transformation. Ethan found the strength to believe again in his new life, while Clara dedicated herself to rebuilding an existence based on honesty and purpose. Neither of them erased the past, but both learned to deal with it in different ways. Now it's your turn to tell us what you thought of this story. Do you think the characters got what they deserved? What would you have done in Ethan's place? Leave your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal, but believes in the power of narratives to make us reflect on our choices and actions. Until the next story.